Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Smolar. I'm the Director of Educational Programs here at the National History Academy. And today we are continuing our virtual tour through American history sites. And we are excited today to be joining virtually with the National Canal Museum. And here with us, we have Whitney Davison, the Education Manager at the Delaware and Lee National Heritage Corridor. So Whitney, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start my presentation about the American Canal System. And then at the end, if you have any questions, I will be more than happy to answer them and expand on them a little bit. As we know, you really cannot find canals anywhere in the country anymore that is operating as a system of transportation. However, you can still find canals around different areas as recreational type of, almost like a park. And so we have a bunch of those in our area in Pennsylvania, which we have now called the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor. And so because we have this wonderful thing available to us, we've kind of created a whole educational system around that where you can learn about the history of canals, and it's pretty unique to our area. So I'm going to spend a little time today explaining to you why we even have canals, like why do they even exist in this country, what they were for, how they were used, and then a little bit about the lifestyle that sort of surrounded canals. Canals were only here for 100 years, but the lifestyle that erupted around them is pretty interesting to that specific time. So the first thing we have to talk about is why we even have canals to begin with. Before we had airplanes, trucks, and cars, we had the horse and buggy, and we transported many things that way, but it was very inefficient. It was incredibly slow, and you really couldn't transport a lot of goods in one wagon. So people transported as much as they could by boat. The problem with boats was that they could only travel along waterways such as rivers and oceans, and they did not allow for you to go from city to city or from where you would get goods to where you wanted to take them to, right? You kind of had to follow nature, which didn't always work. And this is a great example showing you the horses and buggies pulling up to the ports. So what wound up happening was we moved as much as we could by ships and by horse and buggy, but eventually coal was discovered in the mountains in eastern Pennsylvania. And due to that, we needed to be able to get the coal out of those mountains and to the big cities such as Philadelphia and New York. So in order to do that, we started by using horses and buggies, but we quickly realized you couldn't move a lot of coal. It was too heavy. It took way too long, and we needed way too much coal, like in a quick succession, for the cart to work. So as a result, we turned our attention to water. We knew that, all right, well, it's easy to get things across the ocean, so why don't we look at rivers? And there were river systems that went from the mountains to the big cities, namely the Lehigh River into the Delaware River. So we started out by trying to use the river system, which might make some sense, but there were a few issues with it. First of all, rivers only run one way, and this was before the age of engines, right? So you could get your boats down the river, but you couldn't get your boats back up the river. Another issue with rivers is, as you know, they can be very deep, which is great, but they can also be very shallow, which is not great. And so once you hit that area where it was shallow and you had a boat that was laden with coal, you got yourself in a little bit of trouble. So because of all of these issues, they decided, you know what, we need to find a better way to transport goods, but they still were interested in trying to figure out a way to do that using water. And what they came up with was the canal system. Now, the people who developed the canal system did not invent canals. There was already the Erie Canal in New York, and there was also canal systems all over Europe. So they looked to those canals to help them figure out how to build canals here to create a much faster, more reliable system. So by creating a system of canals that ran from the coal mines in the mountains to the big cities, people were able to create a reliable, safe, fast system to move large, heavy amounts of coal to where people needed it. It took 2.5 years to build the 46 miles of the Lehigh navigation from Maw Chunk, which is now called Jim Thorpe in Pennsylvania, to Easton, Pennsylvania. It took 1,000 men to build it. They built it without the use of machinery, just shovels, saws, axes, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows. And this is an example of them at work building a section of the canal. Once it was built, there was a lot of upkeep to keep it running. Parts of the canal needed to be drained and repaired regularly. By the 1850s, there were 2,000 boats on the canal system. This is a map of Pennsylvania, kind of showing you where all the canals went. And as you can see, it pretty much crisscrosses the entire state. And that area in red is the Lehigh and the Delaware Canal, which is where our focus is. That little red star is kind of, little gold star is kind of a rough spacing of where our museum is located. So canals are an engineering marvel, but it took people to make it run, right? Again, we're still talking before the time of engines. So the key players in this endeavor were the captains, the mule tenders, and the lock tenders. Without these three roles, the canals would not have been able to function. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to go into these different roles and different portions of the canal system and learn a little bit more about how they worked and also the lifestyles that the people sort of created. So the first thing you're wondering is, well, how does this lock system work, right? So they dug these huge trenches alongside riverbeds, and they generally were between 6 and 10 feet deep, and they were anywhere from 10 to 20 feet wide, and then they flooded them with water. And that water was what allowed the boats to move up and down the canal. They made it wide enough that two boats could pass one another, one going down and one coming up when they needed to. And the great thing about canals is that they are still water. The water does not move, and it is deep enough that you don't have to worry about hitting rocks or whatnot. But they controlled the water. So if it rained a lot, they could let water out. If it wasn't raining very much or they needed to add water, they could let water in. They also drained the canals in the winter because frozen water obviously damages the canal walls. So the canal was closed in the winter, and all of that was done through their gate and lock systems of controlling the water. So in this picture, you see that there is a boat coming up to a lock system. You can see a boat that has already gone through. So that first boat is going to stop at the lock gate and is going to wait until it is allowed in. And the way that that works is this gate kind of stands up in the water, floats up in the water, and when the gears bring it down, it allows the water to flood in. And when the water floods in, the boat can then follow it right in. So this is another example of how the drop gate worked. And there was always a little house on the side, usually where the gears were, and a man who stood there and moved the gears all day, every day. We'll get into what that lifestyle was like to have that kind of a job. This is where, so here you see the picture in the background where that drop gate is. That would be what the boat has come over, and then the boat would sit in this chamber, and the lock tender guy would run up to what we call the doghouse, and he would open the front gate to let the boat and the water out. So that is how the lock worked. And they used this hand crank system. Again, no engines, just all manpower. And this was actually an upgrade. There used to be a system that they called a bounce beam method that was more primitive than this. So this was like the fancier version. So that was how the lock gate worked. Now we're going to watch. These are there's a series of videos we're going to watch, and they are from the 1920s, maybe the 1930s. They're silent films. We have a voiceover on them, and so they are grainy and kind of hard to see, but they're really cool because they're actual, real lock tenders and boat captains moving. So this first one is just showing you how a boat actually locked through.
Here comes the old watchman again with his collection of maps and dog-eared canal literature, just as if he'd never shown it to the boys a dozen times before. The Lehigh Canal, he always explains, got its water from and followed the Lehigh River. Used to be used mostly for hauling coal from the Pennsylvania anthracite regions, some 70 miles above Easton. South from Easton, here, the canal followed the Delaware River most of the way and was called the Delaware Canal. A big dam across the Lehigh at Easton channels the waters of the canal and river so that they feed the Delaware Canal. Rest of the water spills into the Delaware River. Coal barges from the Lehigh were often ferried across the Delaware River here and sent on to New York Bay through New Jersey's Morris Canal, whose gateway still stands on the banks of the Delaware at Phillipsburg, like a massive monument to the canal era. Pennsylvania's Lehigh Canal and River merged as one in many places. This unique cable bridge, about 2 miles above the Easton Dam, in spite of its roller coaster characteristics, was built to accommodate mule teams in the serious business of transferring the canal boat route from one shore of the Lehigh River to the other. It was always kind of a dreamland through here. He stands there sometimes staring. I'm sure he has wonderful visions of boats still coming through. In their heyday, there were over 2,000 boats operating through the Lehigh and Delaware canals, capable of carrying 70 to 80 tons of coal, sometimes with the captain's family to boot in the tiny stern end compartment. Every few miles, the boats had to be put through a lock which carried them to a higher or lower terrain. Fistfights often flared between captains to determine whose boat was going through first. In spite of the snail's pace light in which canal transportation is regarded today, you moderns would stare bug-eyed if you could have seen with what speed canalers put their clumsy 100-foot hulls through a lock. Well, not quite this fast. These scenes were taken when movies were silent and films were projected slower. Once inside the deep stone wall chamber, water level was regulated with the gates, producing the smoothest running, most powerful elevator ever conceived by man. Tons of coal hoisted as smoothly, as silently as a mere leaf on the water surface. Only minutes after entering the lock, sturdy mules had the boats on their way again. But, as we've seen, the pace of the iron horse could not be matched. When fallen revenue dropped and spring floods rose, ripping away the banks, with no money for repair, 100 years of American transportation history went down the drain.
All right, so that was a pretty good video showing you what it actually looked like when they went through. And so now I'm going to share with you some images of the boat itself. So the canal was important, obviously. You couldn't have a canal system without the canals. And obviously the boats were important because that was the method that was used to transport goods. The entire reason the canal system was built was simply to transport goods from one location to another, whether it was raw goods that was going to be turned into a product or whether it was finished goods. Eventually, these canals were also used to transport people, but that was kind of a secondary use. And along the Lehigh and Delaware Canal, especially the Lehigh Canal, it was pretty rare to have passenger canal boats. The Delaware, it was a little bit more common, and some of those other canal systems that you saw on the map, it was even more common. So this picture shows you a hinge boat. You can see if you look halfway down, you can see like a gap in the two boats. The boats were actually connected by chain. This allowed for easier mobility and also the ability to have different size boats if you wanted to, although most of them were always put together like this. What you can see is the couple here. They are standing on the deck, and that is where canal families and captains spent their days. They really did not go below deck very much. Almost that entire boat below deck was reserved for holding the coal. The last 10 feet or so, kind of like from sort of where the woman is standing to the back of the boat, was a captain's quarters below deck, but it was very small. It was about 10 by 10 or 10 by 12, depending on the dimensions of the boat. The entire rest of the boat was reserved for carrying coal or whatever goods they might have been carrying. And as you can see, there's like literally no safety features on this canal boat. You needed to make sure you did not fall in the canal. This is another image of what the top of the canal boat looked like. So you can see here a couple things. You kind of see the roof lines for the hatches for putting the coal underneath, and you can see like some ropes and things like that. But you also see a coal stove. That was the stove they used to cook on. You see a bin of coal that they personally could use, and then you see a barrel, and inside that barrel there might be water. It's most likely water, drinkable water, but it could be other things as well. So they kind of had like almost an outdoor kitchen, if you will, on top of the boat that they used. Now these are kind of these are diagrams of what the inside of the cabin looked like. And as you can see, we're going to take a little bit closer look of this picture in its sections, but you can see that there's a top hatch to get down. You can see in relation to how tall the man is standing, how tall the little cabin is, and then you can see that there is not much inside the cabin. So let's look first at the hatch. So first of all, where you see that tiller, that is where the captain stood all day, every day. Notice there is no chair. The man stood the entire day, and his sole job was to navigate moving the canal boat down the canal. There's a cargo hatch that you see that's closed, and then the cabin hatch is open. The cabin hatch is just like a trap door with a ladder that went down below. And again, it was only about 7 feet high. So there, you didn't have to stoop to be down there, but it wasn't great to be too tall. And as you can see from this side angle, they did have some windows that they could open for fresh air. There was a stove down there. There was a ladder, and essentially there was a beds and table, and that was it. The interesting thing about their use of the space is that everything was fold up. So the bed's folded up, the table folded up, and that bench in a corner was also, you could open it and store things inside. Generally, they were only in this space to sleep anyway, and so you would want the furniture open to sleep, but depending on the weather and maybe what the wife needed to do, there might be reason to be down there during the day, so it was good that the furniture was able to fold up. Now the picture I showed you before showed a stove outside, and this picture shows you a stove inside. They all had stoves inside. The captains who maybe were a little more affluent could have a stove on the outside, but you had to pay to have a second stove. It was horribly hot down there to have to cook. And again, this was closed in the winter. Canal boats were closed in the winter. So it was in the dead of summer that you would be cooking down there. So if they could afford to have a stove on deck, they certainly chose to do that. And I keep mentioning the wife. We're going to get into that a little bit more when we talk about the captains. But canaling was a family affair, and it was not uncommon to have your entire family in this teeny tiny 10 by 10 room. So I don't just mean a husband and wife, I also mean all of their children. If they were not traveling with their family and they had a hired help, the captain and the hired help all stayed down in this cabin. So now that brings us to boat captains. We're going to spend a little time talking about boat captains. I love this picture because not most, but many of the captains who ran on the Lehigh Coal and Navigation were family men. The reason for this is that the people who started Lehigh Coal and Navigation, Erskine Hazard and Josiah White, they were Quakers, and they wanted to have a kind of, for lack of a better word, a bit of a wholesome business. And sailors back then had a pretty bad reputation for being a little unsavory. However, family men were considered to be a little calmer, less likely to party, less likely to fight, less likely to have drinking problems and other issues. So they tried very hard to attract family men, husbands and fathers to the profession. Well, they knew if they were trying to attract those men, they had to allow for them to have their families on the boat, because essentially from about April through November, if you were a canal boat captain, you lived on the boat. You never left the boat. They had Sundays off, and so they could park their boat alongside the canal and go into whatever town they were near. But that was it. The rest of the week, they were running their boat. So you had to be able to bring your family. That was good for the captains because their family could be their crew, and then they didn't have to hire out and pay other people wages. So the captain was able to keep all of his wages for himself and his family. Now, the captains generally, they did not work for Lehigh Coal Navigation. They were kind of like contractors. And so they could either rent the boat from Lehigh Coal Navigation, and then they had to pay for the boat every month and keep what they could in wages, or they could own their own boat and kind of be like a contractor for Lehigh Coal Navigation. So here you see a man standing at the tiller. That's literally how he would stand all day. That was his entire job, was to stand there and move that tiller back and forth and navigate through the locks. You see his wife, she looks like she's doing some sort of housework, and then you see his son and daughter, and we are assuming that he has another probably son who's the mule tender, who's on the trail. Canal boat captains, it was actually a nice job to have, because at the time, if you were a working man, if you were uneducated and you kind of had one of these lower wage jobs, the majority of the lower wage jobs that people could do at this time was you could work in a factory, you could be a farmer, you could be a miner. That was pretty much it. And with the exception of farming, mining and factory work was dangerous and dirty. They weren't paid well, and they certainly weren't treated well by their bosses. So canal boat operating was great because you were your own boss. You were on the canal all day, out in the fresh air. It was relatively safe. It wasn't very dirty. Certainly wouldn't get you sick. And you were respected by your entire community, the people that you passed on the canal. Now, the people in the towns that you went through may not have really respected you very much, but the day-to-day people you spent time with did. Like I said, it was a family job, so it was often passed down from family member to family member. So this picture is great because we see a dad and we see his two children, his two boys. And we can assume that one of those boys at least was a mule tender, probably both. They probably took turns, and they may have grown up to become canal boat captains themselves. So now I'm going to show you a quick video. This one is of two boats passing each other. It's kind of neat to see how that worked.
When boats going different directions passed each other, the boat next to the towpath bank kept its tow line tight and mules moving. The boat on the outside dropped its tow line into the canal and let it sink underneath the other boat. The mule driver of the outside boat slowed down and gave right-of-way to the other boat's mule. Fights often broke out when rules of passing weren't followed. The canal had places where excess water spilled into the Delaware River. Here's one near Lumberville. Mules got a refreshing dip in the water. Mule drivers stayed dry by crossing a wood plank. Note the team of 3 mules. Most teams had 2 animals, but some captains preferred 3, especially if the only cargo they carried was heavy coal.
All right, so speaking of mules, I don't know why I always said that. Speaking of mules, let's talk about mules. These little guys that you see in front of you are our mules at the National Canal Museum. Their names are Hank and George. They are very large. They're not actual blood brothers, although as far as they're concerned, they're brothers. They were both born from Percheron draft horse mothers, so they are very big. They are 18 and 21, and they have been together since they were very young, about 3 and 6 years old, and we've had them for about that long as well, about 12 years or a little bit more we've had them. They spend their late spring, all summer, and early fall with us here at the museum, towing the canal boat back and forth, and then they go to winter at a nearby farm. I'm going to show you a video of Hank and George, basically, and some historic photos kind of moving around on my screen. There is no sound. I decided to mute it and talk over the video. but I wanted you to see them in action. This is them out in their paddock with one of their caretakers, and they're just kind of running around. She's shaking leaves because they don't like that sound, so she's having them move so you can see it for the camera. For a little bit, another of our educators, he's going to stand there, and he's, again, I muted him. He's just like 20 seconds, and then I'll go back to some visuals of Hank and George. So Hank and George, like I said, are mules, and mules were commonly used on the canals. Now, a mule cannot make another mule. The way that we have mules is mules are a female horse and a male donkey. And when those two mate, they create a mule. If you have a male horse and a female donkey, you get an animal called a henny, which is essentially a mule. They're just smaller, and they were not as coveted on the canal as a mule was because they were smaller and not as strong. They were used in coal mines at times because of their small stature. So a mule was chosen over a horse for a variety of reasons. First of all, they tend to be stronger and smarter than horses and donkeys. They eat less than horses, and they are also healthier. Horses are prone to injury. They're prone to issues with their stomach, things like that. Mules are not. Mules are a little bit sturdier, and they don't require as much food, so they cost less to feed. They also don't require the same level of care that a horse does, so they can be out in the elements a little bit more. They don't necessarily need to be stabled. The other really amazing thing about mules is that they will not allow themselves to be pushed to exhaustion. So you might think to yourself, well, why is this a good thing? Well, Josiah White, as I said, was a religious man, and he was a Quaker, and he felt strongly that animals should be well cared for. So he came up with an interesting rule for the Lehigh Coal navigation. The captains did not have to own their own boats, but they did have to own their own mules. And mules were expensive, just as they would be today. So in order to be a captain on our canal system, you had to own not just one, but 2 mules. Some people even chose to own 3 because they worked in what we call a tandem team, like these 2 are right now in this video. And the idea was that if they owned their own mules, they would take care of them better. Maybe you've heard the phrase "work like a rented mule." That's the idea that because you don't own the animal, you don't necessarily have to take care of it. And once you've run it into exhaustion, you can get another one. So by owning it, you're going to want to get your money's worth, so to speak. And mules can live up to about 30 years, and they can actually work into their 20s. So the better you take care of them, the more years you get out of them. And so it is great that they will stop themselves if they are hungry, if they are thirsty, if they go lame, if they're heat exhausted, they will stop and let their owner know, nope, I need a break, right? So that's actually a benefit. Now, they would eat 3 times a day. They could walk up to 18 hours a day, which would roughly translate into about 30 miles a day. They didn't always do that much, but they could. They would walk with pulling that boat, just like that. That is how the engine worked, right? There's nothing else in the boat. You don't see a sail, you don't see an engine, you don't see paddles. It was just the mules pulling the boat, right? And so they could walk between 2 to 6 miles per hour along the canal. So it's very slow. You see how slow our mule tenders are walking there? They're like sauntering along, right? So it was a slow, long day. They tried to average about 4 miles an hour on the canal. They wanted to keep all the boats kind of moving at the same speed, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The mules and the mule tenders only really got breaks during the day when they were locking through a lock. So when they would get to a lock, as we showed you earlier, the mules would get to stop for a little while as the boat moved through the lock system, and then they had to continue on down the way. So sometimes the mule tenders would take that time to feed them. Other times they would feed them with feed sacks that they would put onto their harnesses, and they would eat while they walked. They would sleep either tied up on the side of the trails, or if they came to a mule barn, they could stable them in the mule barn for the night. So that is our mules. We're going to move forward to talk about our mule tenders. Now, mule tenders' job was to essentially tend the mules. Their entire day was centered around taking care of the mules. You could become a mule tender at the ripe old age of 8 years old. And as you can tell, these guys don't look very old, maybe 10, maybe 14. And if you became a mule tender, you walked all day next to your mule. You got up at 3 a.m. in the morning and you walked, you got the mule ready. You were on the trail by 4. The mules and yourself had breakfast as you were walking down the trail. You had your 3 meals over the course of the day. And canal boat captains, the canal was open until 10 p.m. So it wasn't uncommon for captains to decide to ride until 10 p.m. because, like I said before, if you could only go 4 miles per hour and you couldn't go any faster because there were canal boats in front of you and behind you, then the only way you could move farther in a day was by going longer into the night. So it wasn't uncommon for captains to decide to run until 10 p.m. at night, which meant that the mule tender and the mules walked until 10 p.m. at night. Once the 10 p.m. hit and the canal closed down, the mule tenders had to bed down the mules before they themselves could go to bed. So they had to take their harnesses off, they had to clean the harnesses, clean the mules, give them their last drink of water, their last meal if they hadn't already eaten. That could take up to an hour before they themselves crawled into bed at 11 to wake up and do it all over again at 3 a.m. They didn't make as much money as the captain, and if they were the captain's child, they might not make any money. So it was a pretty tough job. And if you were a child on the canal, if you were a child of a canal captain or you were a mule tender, you did not go to school because your boat was constantly moving. So we've talked about boats, we've talked about mules, we've talked about how the canal was built and what it looked like. And so the other important job is that of the lock tenders and the houses and families. As you saw in those videos, you needed people to physically open and close the lock system. And as I have mentioned, the canal system was open from 4 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. So that required a lot of time on the lock. So what they decided to do was they would build lock tender homes, and the families who were the lock tenders could live in that home free of charge. They were paid between $8 to $12 a month, that was it, to live at the lock house and open and close the gate. So that wasn't a very lot of money even for back then, but it wasn't a half bad job considering the fact that you got free housing and you could stay in that house for as long as you could operate the locks. And so what that meant was as long as somebody could operate the locks, including children, you could live there. So it wasn't uncommon for a husband to go ahead and take the job, but then go into town to find other work to help supplement his income. Now this picture here, you see a man, clearly a husband and father, who was the lock tender, and he would have been the one to get the paycheck every month. However, his wife or children could open and close the lock all day long. There was a few other jobs the lock tender had to do. They were responsible to keep time and record of every boat that went through the lock. The reason for that was because that was their way of knowing how fast the boats were going. So if a captain went too fast and was maybe going 6 miles an hour on the canal, that's too fast for the other boats. It's not safe, it's not good for the mules. So as they were keeping their records, that allowed for another job along the canal was to fine captains if they were breaking the rules. So by the lock tender keeping track of when boats went through, that allowed for those who were in charge of fining canal boat captains to see who they needed to track down and fine, who they needed to talk to about how they were behaving. So that was kind of the lock tender's other job. I'm going to show you a video very quickly of what it looked like to lock through. This is a great historic picture. It's a mom and her 2 daughters, and they are running the lock this day. Maybe the husband is on the other side, or maybe he is at another job. So here we go. You should see it pop up. And
passing through a lock required teamwork between the canal boat crew and the lock tender. This boat is entering Lock 17 next to Treasure Island in Bucks County. The boat is heading north and must be lifted. As the boat enters the lock, the upper gate, or drop gate, is already closed in an upright position. The boat is pulled into the lock and secured with ropes. Then the miter gate behind the boat is closed and a long water elevator is formed in which the boat rests. To fill the lock with water and raise the boat, The lock tender opens wickets, a kind of water valve located underneath the drop gate. As the lock fills, the boat rises like a floating cork. The drop gate falls slowly and settles on the bottom of the lock underneath the boat. When the water level in the lock is equal to that of the canal, the wooden walkway across the upper end of the lock is swung open and the boat is pulled from the lock by mules waiting on the towpath. Boats headed downriver were always lowered in a lock. Lowering was simply the reverse of lifting. Boats being lowered always entered a lock that was full of water. The lower gates, the miter gates, were closed and watertight. The drop gate was lowered so that the boat could pass safely over it and enter the lock. Once the boat was in the lock, the drop gate was raised, which prevented canal water from entering the lock. With the boat now in a closed lock, the idea was to empty the water slowly and allow the boat to be lowered to the bottom. The lock was emptied by opening a set of wickets located at the bottom of the miter gate doors. Water rushed through the wickets and into the canal, and the boat went down in the lock. The wickets were kept open until the level of water inside the lock was equal to that of the canal below it. The final step was to open the miter gate doors. Here you see two women opening the miter gate by turning a geared iron wheel located underneath small wooden dog houses. The gate doors opened inward and rested alongside the lock walls. Once the doors were open, the mules waiting on the towpath below the lock pulled the boat out and continued their journey south. The lock doors were closed, and the lock refilled with water for the next boat headed downstream.
Okay, so that was a nice video that kind of shows you how the lock system works. Now, one more thing, and then we're almost done. As I told you, the fathers could go into town and get other jobs, maybe at a factory or on a farm or at a shop or whatever, to help supplement the income. Well, the wives really needed to stay home because being a housewife back then was definitely a full-time job and required a lot of time spent at home doing chores as well as taking care of the children, as there was no daycares back then. But they could run side jobs out of their home, and they often did. There was many needs the canal captains needed to have fulfilled that they couldn't do because they literally spent 24 hours a day on their boat 6 days a week. So lock tender wives would fill those gaps. They would often have rather large gardens in which they would sell the goods to canal captains as they went by. They also ran something called a mule barn, which I mentioned before. Many lock tender homes would have a mule barn attached where you could rent space for your mule for the night for a few pennies, and they would get some good hay and they would be out of the elements for the evening. That was a popular one. Another very popular one was baking bread. You saw before the coal stove that was on the canal boats. Well, those coal stoves were too tiny to have an oven. So anything that needed to be baked had to be purchased, such as bread and pies and other things like that. So they would oftentimes sell baked goods. And they also ran some of the more affluent, more ambitious lock tender families would build a general store off of their lock tender house and sell all kinds of things. And those lock tenders really found themselves a nice lucrative business. So while they're locking through, like you can see in this picture in the foreground, you can see a boat going and locking through, going under the bridge. The mule tender could stop and run inside that store and get whatever the canal captain wanted him to get and be back out just in time to continue walking the mules down the path. The last one that I want to mention is close to our heart here because our lock tender house here was a laundry lock. So if you looked at the canal boats, there was obviously very minimal space inside and above to really live. Doing laundry was quite difficult, especially because laundry was very involved back then, as you can tell by all the tubs this woman has. So running laundries was something that many women would do from the lock tender house. So a captain would go by, throw a sack of dirty clothes to the laundry woman as he went by. She would have about a week to get that laundry done before she'd see that captain again. And during that time, she'd wash and dry and press the clothes, and then she would toss the sack back to him when he would go by, and he would toss her the amount of money she charged. So it was a pretty lucrative and easy business, although she spent all day, every day out in the yard doing the wash. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. Hopefully you found it informative and you learned some things about the canal system that you did not already know. This is a picture of our museum with Hank and George going by, and our canal boat that you can actually ride in if you come visit us in Easton, Pennsylvania. So at this time, Katie, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing all that. We do have some questions. One was actually, can you ride a boat today? So you got that one for us.
Yes, so we do have a canal boat. It doesn't look like the canal boats that they use because ours has a lot of safety features. But yes, you can definitely experience how slow it is.
That's very cool. It kind of ties into another question. That seems probably like an exciting attraction for people visiting. What's your personal favorite part of the Heritage Corridor or exhibit at the museum?
Well, I just love, so the Heritage Corridor is miles and miles and miles of tow paths that have been converted to leisure paths. So people bike them, walk them. There's some parts you can take your horses on, walk their dogs, things like that. So I love the corridor as a whole just because it's so beautiful and it runs along the canal. Most of the canal is not maintained and doesn't have water in it, but it's still a really magical place. So I just really enjoy visiting the different parts of the system.
Yeah, the pictures look beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
What impact did the canals have on the economies of the local communities?
So the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania is kind of an industrial hub of PA because of where it is located between Philadelphia and New York. And this was sort of a key part in it that is oftentimes forgotten because the canal system died because of the railroad. So once the railroad came through, they were faster, they were better, they didn't break down as much, you could use them year round. The canals sort of died. But the railroads followed where the canals were because the land had already been changed to accommodate the canal, so it was already cleared and flat. And so because of the fact that we had the coal in the mountains, and then we ran this transportation system through here and went to the cities, it really allowed for the Lehigh Valley to grow a lot of industries. And they really did, and we've always been sort of an industrial area. So
With the railroads coming, was there a crossover with workers who were out of work once the canal sort of died out? Did they typically go into the railroads, or were people suddenly without a job?
I can't answer that definitively, but I do know that there was a time period of about 50 years where the canals and the railroads operated together, and then it was a slow die out of the canals. And the Lehigh Canal was actually the last canal in operation. It died in 1941, which, as we know, by that point we had cars and trucks and everything. So yeah, it was generally, as we needed less and less canal boats, it became a thing where a child growing up who could have just continued on into his father's footsteps and become a canal boat captain knew that he had to find another line of work, that being a captain was not going to be an option for him.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So considering that this was a family endeavor, how closed off were women's roles in the canal business?
How what were women's roles?
How closed off were they, or how maybe what opportunities could they get to?
Okay, so women unfortunately could not really be hired by the Lehigh Coal Navigation. They did not hire them. However, what was interesting was that women were allowed to do all of the jobs that men could do. So although they were not necessarily receiving the paycheck, the house lease wasn't in their name for the lock tender house, they had the freedom and autonomy to do all of the jobs. So it wasn't uncommon to see like a boat going by with a woman at the tiller because her husband was taking a break. It wasn't uncommon to see a 12-year-old girl being the mule tender because her and her brother shared that job together. So while they weren't written down on paper as the person who was employed and receiving the paycheck, they did get to do all of the jobs that the men could do. So I don't know if that's good or bad, because they weren't receiving the paycheck, but they were helping out their family and getting to do something beyond just chores.
Kind of a win for women's rights.
Yeah, yeah.
So your organization, what's the central message to visitors today, and also what work goes into preserving the canals today?
The central message that we try to pass on at the Canal Museum, it's a little different on the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor. So the Delaware-Lehigh National Heritage Corridor, our central message is what you see on the bottom of the screen right now, which is to connect, revitalize, preserve, celebrate, and sustain the corridor and all that it has. The museum itself is to tell the story of the canal, the history of it, but also the engineering and science behind it, because that is pretty interesting. And we have a vast system. So we don't actually own any of the land that the towpaths are on. We work pretty closely with the landowners, and the landowners can be anything from a private backyard that the towpath happens to run through, to state parks and county parks and things of that nature. So we work kind of as an umbrella unit to help coordinate all of the players involved to try to maintain the system so that the public can use it, and also continue to revitalize it and connect it. We're 46 miles, not all of which is connected. We're actually 165 miles through our 5 counties, and we are trying to get all 165 miles connected so that you could technically ride from the top to the bottom and never actually have to go on like a busy road or highway, which is still a work in progress.
Yeah, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
We've got time for one more question, and we always like to end with this one for our students watching. A lot are interested in potentially getting a job in a history-related field one day. Would you mind sort of sharing how you got your start, and if you have any advice for students looking to get into a similar line of work?
Sure. So I was a middle school history teacher for 20 years. That's how I got my start. But I wanted to get into museum education. I'm the education manager here for a very long time. The problem was I wasn't willing to leave the Lehigh Valley. This is where my family is and everything. And so, you know, if you're in like New York or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., I mean, there's just so much opportunity. But living in a smaller area, it's a little bit more difficult. So I just had to keep my eyes open, keep my resume out there, follow leads. I honestly didn't even really think that I had much of a chance with this job when I applied for it. So my first piece of advice would be to not sell yourself short and not be that bad voice in the back of your head saying, oh, don't even bother. And they were really interested in me particularly because of my education background. Like that really helped me. I guess when I was hired, I was up against like a librarian and somebody who had more of an environmental background, and they went with me because of my education background. But museum education is an amazing career choice. And if you are thinking about it, I do highly recommend it.
Great advice. And thank you for sharing that. And Whitney, thank you so much for being with us today and teaching us more about this site.
Great. Thank you.
All right. And everyone, thank you for joining us. We will be back here next week, Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, as we virtually visit with Lewis and Clark National Historical Parks. I hope to see you there, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.